Hello, I'm going to continue with this book. You see it? Stiffapolyp by Alex Renton. Secrets, Crimes, and the Schooling of a Ruling Class, the English ruling class. Yes, I had an introductory video, episode 1, and I'm going to continue now. Just a few more things. In the book, the author starts with he deals mainly with two subjects. One was physical punishment, caning, and sometimes atrocious physical punishment. I mean, actually, lashes with birch. I hadn't. I mean, I came across this kind of lashing with birch in Russian novels. Dostoevsky in one of his books, serfs, in the 19th century would get lashes, but this went on in these public schools in England for quite a while. And he has many examples. We saw how much research he has done and so on. And he went through the public school system himself. That's one part of the book. The other part is the um, sexual activity of adolescents and pre-puberty, actually, small boys, and abuse in that sphere. Uh, Young boys playing with each other, but also the role that the masters, the teachers, and the headmasters had, and that is quite different because it seems to me to be sort of institutionalized. And I thought I would deal with this issue first, because at the moment we are hearing Epstein is on the news and the elites and all this, and this type of thing is very much on the news. And I wanted to see how is a tradition that actually is there for it's a tradition of the elite, of the ruling classes. How did it all? How does this thing? How did it all start? What is a tradition here to associate um, elitism and ruling class and power with associated with sexuality? Okay, so let's see. Chapter 28 deals with the war on lust. Public schools are the very seats and nurseries of vice. This is from um, a speech by Dr. Thomas Arnold, headmaster of the rugby school, 1828 to 1842. And he says public schools are the very seats and nurseries of vice. It may be unavoidable or it may not, but the fact is indisputable. None can pass through a large school without being pretty intimately acquainted with vice, and few, alas, very few, without tasting of that poisoned bowl. A note here, he says the mid-Victorians used vice or evil for things for rebelliousness, from rebelliousness to gambling. Immorality could mean masturbation or more. In 1896, Winston Churchill successfully sued for libel over an allegation that he had committed acts of gross immorality of the Oscar Wilde type while a cadet at Sandhurst. The author, Alex Renton, continues, it is no surprise that sex was always pretty popular among adolescents in boarding schools. What seems significant in a story of how the schools shaped the psychology of their product, the students, are the efforts to control or suppress the children's sexuality. There was hardly a matter concerning the genitals, from masturbation to menstruation, where the traditional boarding schools did not utterly fail in their job as educators. Instead, they fostered in their charges ignorance, prejudice, fear, and guilt. They would not be the only ones in this sphere, and some of those quite deliberately. The history of sex education in British schools is a story of stupid mistakes and ideologically driven failures right up to the present day. I'll just choose examples. Even at the high tide of Victorian panic about businesslessness in the dormitories, there were people ready to mock the scaremongers. They were trying. It is a stiff upper lip trait to tell people to calm down and stop making a fuss. In 1881, the headmaster of Clifton College, J.M. Wilson, gave a much reported speech titled Morality and the Public School that kicked off the nation's first ever debate about sex education. Wilson starts with a dire warning. Quote, it must, I believe, be admitted as a fact that immorality, used in a special sense which I need not define, has been of late increasing among the upper classes in England, and especially in the great cities. Wilson's prose, he continued for a while, Wilson's prose is ponderous, but the message is panic-struck. He offered remedies to his fellow schoolmasters for dealing with this nation-threatening immorality. Exercise, he would say to the students and the masters, exercise to the point of exhaustion, occupations to fill dangerous spare time, and mechanical arrangements. These may have been dormitory cubicles or perhaps the metal chastity devices then available. There was also religion, that proven anti-aphrodisiac. His speech was given to the Education Society and later published as a pamphlet. It was widely reported. There were fulminations about vicious habit and monastic evils in the Journal of Education. It applauded Wilson for attempting to lay bare the cancer of upper-class education. But into the seething letters column of the journal stepped Olim Etoniensis, and Old Etonian. He pooh-poohed all the fuss. It wasn't that there was no immorality, he said, there was lots. But its effects were ludicrously misrepresented, as he could show from the long list of his own immoral contemporaries. If Wilson and company were right, then, he said, why, of course, he wrote, why, of course, I should have to point to physical wrecks, men who have dragged hitherto a miserable existence, praise, not martyrs, to consumption and atrophy and insanity. or else outcast from all good society. But what do I find? That those very boys have become cabinet ministers, statesmen, officers, clergymen, country gentlemen, etc. That they are nearly all of them fathers of thriving families, respected and prosperous. The moral to the point is that happily an evil so difficult to cure is not so disastrous in its results. How many boys, or rather men, can Mr. Wilson point to who owe their ruin to the immorality which he talks of? Olim Etoniensis was not alone. There are plenty like him in the Victorian periodicals, most often leaping with worrying enthusiasm to the defense of school flogging. But for the next 3 or 4 decades, the moralists were firmly in charge, battling beastliness with trusted tools, sermon, Bible, cane, hard physical exercise, and occasionally patented chastity gadgets made of tin and leather. Goodness. Okay, so let me go now to another one. In chapter 30, he talks about the most vicious beastliness. From Dr. William Acton, 1857. He talks about those boys who were engaged in immorality. And he says, in extreme cases, the outward signs of debasement are only too obvious. The frame is stunted and weak, the muscles underdeveloped, the eye is sunken and heavy, the complexion is sallow, pasty, or covered with spots of acne. The hands are damp and cold, and the skin moist. The boy shuns the society of others, creeps about alone, joins with repugnance in the amusements of his schoolfellows. He cannot look anyone in the face, and becomes careless in dress and uncleanly in person. His intellect has become sluggish and enfeebled, and if his evil habits are persisting, he may end in becoming a driveling idiot or a peevish valetudinarian. Such boys are to be seen in all the stages of degeneration, but what we have described is but the result towards which they are all tending. Okay. It's very explicit in many cases that meet the extraordinary catalogue of rules and sermons. If you touch it, it will fall off, was the unusually succinct advice of one Edwardian headmaster. Condemning masturbation was being used to scare children well into the 1970s. But in the 19th and early 20th century, schools would expel those engaged in it, fearing that they would infect others. Indecency was a virus. So masturbation was widely said to lead not just to stupidity, but homosexuality and murder. It is hardly surprising that there were suicides from guilt and shame about the act. Elsewhere, education about it led to quite unintended results. The novelist Arthur Calder Marshall remembered how, in the 1920s, his school, St. Paul's, used to take boys on prayer retreats in the holidays. They were the older ones. The older ones were tasked with warning the youngest about the risks of it. The teenage instructors used to compete to get the prettiest youngster as their pupil. Adults or older schoolboys teaching the younger to masturbate is quite common in accounts I've been given. Okay. What is clear is that, as with most growing teenagers, there was passion as much as there was lust. There are moving accounts of loving platonic friendships between schoolboys playing and poeticizing together in the 19th century. Later, when the laws on homosexuality were reorganized and notions of unmanliness came into the dialogue of the public schools, all that changed. But before the 1880s, adolescent boys had no fear of using the word love about each other, or indeed their teachers. The fear was all about the opposite sex. John Addington Symonds, the poet and first historian of homosexuality, was at Harrow in the 1850s. Then, nighttime in the dormitories and studies was incredibly obscene, he says. This is from a suppressed section of his memoirs. These are his words. Every boy of good looks had a female name and was recognized as either a public prostitute or as some big fellow's bitch. Bitch was the word in common usage to indicate a boy who yielded his person to another. One could not avoid seeing acts of onanism, mutual masturbation, and the sport of boys in bed together. There was no refinement, no sentiment, no passion, nothing but animal lust in these occurrences. They filled me with disgust and loathing. Those are his words. But, the author says, as his biographers have pointed out, Simon's feelings were in fact more complex, and he fell in love with several boys. Though he was to marry and have children, his diaries make it clear he was largely homosexual. At Harrow, he claims to have successfully rejected the advances of the beasts and remained clean. But he was to help get Harrow's most famous headmaster, Dr. Bourke, sacked for having a relationship with a pupil. Prostitution, casual or organized within the schools, remained an issue into modern times and was often the subject of scandal. It was still customary for a senior to use a pretty young boy as a bed warmer at one of the most important public schools, in quote, at the end of the 19th century, or so claimed the then headmaster of Rugby. For adults, another literature of the schools was emerging, and one of the things it was most interested in was sex. Alec Waugh, that's Evelyn's Waugh elder brother, Alec Waugh novel Loom of Youth in 1917 was a scandalous and groundbreaking text. Not the first to talk openly of love between schoolboys, but certainly the most overt. Waugh, Evelyn's older brother, wrote it when he was 18, just after he'd been forced out of Sherborne School amid a homosexual scandal. It was published the following year when he was serving as a machine gunner in Flanders. It caused as much a stir and sales as Tom Brown's School Days, as that book did in its time. It seems very light now, but it did open the public's eyes to everyday features of school life that schoolmasters and all boys prefer to keep hidden. As Cuthbert Worsley, a near contemporary, put it, homosexuality, bad language, and games mania. By March 1918, War was a hero and a prisoner of war. Nonetheless, he was expelled from the old Sherbornian society by unanimous vote. It seems improbable that parents, the fathers at least, did not know what was commonplace. Squire Brown did, in a novel that outsold Dickens's. He warns young Tom, just off to rugby, quote, if schools are what they were in my time, you'll see a great many cruel, blackguard things done and hear a great deal of foul talk. The schools being founded at around the same time were taking action. At Radley, the founding headmaster, William Sewell, wrote that he had had enough of the notion that the schoolboy must needs go through a career of carelessness, irreligion, acquaintance, familiarity rather, with sin and defilement in order to enable the formation of a manly character. He had had enough with that. He was going to change it. He ordered that all schools' doors be locked at night and ground floor windows have iron bars installed. No one was allowed to leave the school grounds alone. Visiting sport teams from other schools were vetted for moral risks. Sewell warned the boarders. These are his words. Constantly we shall be visiting the dormitory, coming upon you suddenly, until we feel you have strength enough to resist the temptation of being left alone. Coming among you at all hours, myself, the fellows, the prefects, and if we should find it necessary, even our confidential servants. They were trying to eradicate it somewhat, but this severe regime didn't last. By the 1940s, at Radley, romantic homosexual hero worship and a tradition of appreciation of good-looking younger boys known as sticks appears to have been quite normal. Several old boys told Alistair Hickson jolly stories of this for his compilation of anecdotes about sex at public schools. At the height of one widely known affair between two boys, the hymn at morning chapel was, "New every morning is the love, our waking and uprising prove." Having sung the line, the entire school collapsed in giggles. Other writers, from E.M. Forster in his secret novel Maurice, to Julian Mitchell in the 1980s play and film Another Country, made schoolboy love affairs the basis of romantic rebellions against harsh, straight authoritarianism. This followed a tradition that began in the 19th century with Alfred Tennyson writing of passionate platonic love affairs that were prosecuted with beautiful boys at school, the message often being that as adults they would never love so fully and purely. Summing up this period, Gathorne Hardy attempts statistics. He says 25% of the boys had lust affairs and 90% had romantic passion. Cuthbert Worsley was probably reflecting a dominant view from within the institutions when he announced in his 1945 tirade against private education in Barbarians and Philistines, Democracy and the Public Schools, these are his words, that the majority of adolescents somewhere between the ages of 10 and 15 tend to be homosexual. Given that Worsley himself was homosexual and had been both teacher and pupil in boarding schools, there is no reason to doubt him. But the prevailing view became that there was little danger of the queer habit sticking, which was an excuse in itself. Okay. How such traumas were dealt with varied from teenager to teenager. In his memoir, Hitch 22, Christopher Hitchens, at boarding school in the late 50s and early 60s, describes his schoolmates enthusiastically masturbating each other without ever making eye contact. But he adds that 90% of these boys would have punched you in the throat if you had suggested that there was anything homosexual or queer, as they used to say, about what they were doing. The unstated excuse was that this is what one did until the so far unattainable girls became available. Hitchens enjoyed the what he calls monastic sex drama at the Lee's school and did not actually himself lack for partners. And like many of us, he fell in love too. Deprived of obvious love objects, schooled in Victorian romantic verse, he says, he was vulnerable to the fantasy of the romantic idyll. A boy called Guy was his willing partner. When Guy and Chris were exposed by an envious, thick-necked sportocrat, they were forbidden ever to speak to each other again. It was a properly romantic penalty for love, he says. Sexual bullying was as common as bullying itself, and fagging systems could be part of it. At Eton, it was considered proper to select the prettiest boy you could as a fag, though that didn't necessarily mean that you then had sex with them. And at Stowe and others, there were systems whereby sexual favors were traded. They never happened with violence, says Peregrine Worsthorne, the journalist and newspaper editor. He boasted that he had been seduced in the school art room by a younger boy, George Melly, later a famous jazz singer. A lot of buggery went on, Worthstone told The Guardian, and things in that area, but I don't think there was ever anything that brutal. Worthstone's tone is the habitual one. Wry amusement at boyhood peccadillos. When he first arrived at Stowe, the boys tried to drown him in a bath. He continued sleeping with male friends into his 20s. But while Stowe may not have been brutal, other places were. George Monbiot's account of his prep school in the 1970s is not unusual. New boys were routinely groped and occasionally sodomized by the prefects. Sexual assault was and possibly is still a feature of prep school life, as innate as fried bread and British bulldogs. There are many reports of rapes of boys by other pupils in my correspondence, the author said, and from my interviewees. This should not be surprising given that nearly 1 in 10 rapes or attempted rapes investigated by the police now is of men. More accounts of boarding school rape emerge now in published memoirs, as the stigma of being victim to something that might once have been seen as the ultimate in unmanliness lessens. Robert Montague has told of rapes at Eton in the 1960s and having to intervene to stop a victim killing himself. The disc jockey John Peel wrote in his autobiography how older study monitors, the prefects, at Shrewsbury School swapped the younger boys amongst each other when he was there in the mid-50s. The account is characteristically calm, but Peel's fury seeps through his words. They were not, generally speaking, interested in penetration, but more, as we have seen, in what we have come to know as relief, massage, or even in the absence of the below-stairs staff or hunting dogs they possibly slept with at home, warmth. Having experienced few physical expressions of affection at home, something that would have been true, I imagine, of almost every boy in the house, I was rather flattered by these attentions, and was aware, too, that the only people to whom I could turn for help were, by and large, the very people who yearned to cuddle me. In the ups and downs of my school career, I went to both Eton and Brighton College. Male pupils certainly did have sex with each other, though the fact was not openly discussed. I don't think that unless bullying was involved or the age gap was significant, I don't think that either school would have reacted with anything as harsh as expulsion if the authorities had found out. Schools acknowledge what seemed, at least in the boarding single-sex school, an anthropological truth about adolescents kept in confinement. A famous story of one charismatic 1930s headmaster has a parent asking him what he has done about homosexuality among his charges. Quote, "Well, I haven't made it compulsory yet, if that's what you mean," he replied. By the 1960s, when Francis Wynne was at Harrow, a master was well known for his stated view of where the limits lay. "I don't mind mutual masturbation, but I draw the line at buggery." Joe Ray, headmaster of Westminster in the 1970s and 80s, remembered a Harrow housemaster referring to one of his young charges as the school tart. The majority of the teachers then and now had been through the same system. What they knew to be normal would only seem strange or wrong to an outsider. Ray was the first headmaster of any of the great public schools to write openly about sexual matters, and he did it while still in the driving seat. His target, in a polemical book published in 1980, was the old guard still insisting on the virtues of single-sex education. Ray had been educated at boarding school, and he had taught at Harrow and other traditional boarding schools before taking over at one of the oldest and most hidebound. He was certain that homosexual relationships flourished and that exploitation, including prostitution, happened too. He was just as definite about the damage he had seen in the old monosex schools, where the adolescent sex drive was turned in on itself, and any emotion that was tender or affectionate forcibly was suppressed. His words: "It would be ludicrous to suggest that all public school boys grew up emotionally crippled. But in the old-style boarding school, there was a risk of this happening. In that tight little world of taboos and almost total lack of privacy, survival depended on being able to hide your emotions. As a result, some, perhaps many, boys found that as adults they were incapable of giving themselves freely in love. The risk was too great. Their emotions were like the inmates of a concentration camp. They had been confined harshly for so long that when the chance came to go free, they hardly dared do so. This, rather than homosexuality or pseudo-homosexuality, was the likely psychological aftermath of the single-sex boarding school. It is easy to laugh at the anachronisms now, but the confusions, the prejudice, and the lack of help with adolescent difficulties caused vast anguish to some people and to those with whom they lived subsequently. My correspondence, says the author, is full of tales of sexual shame and confusion, sometimes lifelong, all of which might have been avoided. When these culpable failures on the part of the schools were accompanied by invasions of sexual privacy, the effects could devastate, especially when the child was already schooled in hiding his or her emotions. Here is one of my correspondents telling the story of what happened after he had to fight to get away from a teacher who was trying to fondle him. His words: "When my father came to take me out for the weekend, I told him the story in the car. His initial response was, 'Well, I can see that it's upset you,' which sounded to me as though there was no real reason for me to be upset. He did speak to the headmaster about it, and the headmaster then interviewed me. He took the view that I was probably telling lies with malicious intent, but I must have convinced him because the teacher was relieved of his assistant housemaster duties, so he would no longer patrol the dormitories at night. However, he kept his job teaching English to second stream students. I don't think I was the only boy that this teacher approached, but for some reason I became known as the one that the teacher tried it on with. And that may be why several older boys made approaches to me in the succeeding years. I had reported the abuse to the authorities, my father and the headmaster, because I knew in my heart that what had happened was wrong, but the response I got felt like sweeping it under the carpet rather than dealing with it to make it clear that such behavior is wrong and will not be tolerated. As a result, I was no longer quite as sure of my moral compass, and I was not always able to say no with the conviction that was needed. I left school without having come to terms with my sexuality, and the social group I fell into, based around church, was entirely intolerant of homosexuality. I was delighted to have found friends and enthusiastically joined in, unknowingly banging nails into my coffin in the process. At the age of 30, I got married, and I'm still with my wife 28 years later, although after a breakdown 9 years ago, I finally worked out that I am gay. I blame boarding school for screwing me up so that I didn't know myself, he says, and made life choices that I would make differently if I had the chance to go back and make them again. Okay, so that's another view from a different angle. Okay, I'm going to read you chapter 35, the first confession. These are, by the way, private schools, yes, public school, private schools, which are Anglican. Okay, so if we ever talk about, a sermon or something like this, this is in the context of Anglicanism. The story of someone you might find interesting, what happened to this man. It's about if you are abused at a very early age and you don't know exactly what is happening, that you may develop another persona in your mind so as to deal with it. An actual example of it is Richard Meinehayden. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly. Meinehayden. Soldier, spy, scientist, sportsman, and ornithologist, is the very stuff of British boys' fiction. Aristocratic, brave, and cunning, he made a late imperial superhero so perfect that he might be a parody. He was, to choose just one from a host of escapades and adventures, he was the inventor of the haversack ruse. What is that? The deliberate loss of secret battle plans to fool the enemy into posting its forces in the wrong place. He had wit and sang-froid, important in a fully rounded, stiff upper-lipped, boy's own hero. He said, "Why waste a good meal?" as he polished off the Christmas dinner of a German officer whom he had just killed at the table. This was in Tanganyika in 1916. 2 years later, he was in Russia, attempting the rescue of one of the Tsar's daughters from the Bolsheviks. Meineshayden survived many manly scrapes and some humiliations. He was Bond and Bulldog Drummond with a touch of something seedier, too. Since his death, Meineshayden has been the subject of hero worship and a savage revisionist biography. He has been accused of fraud and the murder of his heiress' second wife. But no one has questioned his story of the abuse he suffered at his preparatory school or questioned the extraordinary psychological insights he drew from it. If it didn't happen, you have to ask, why would this proud man bother to invent it? His memoirs, he talks about the pain and so on. The author's point is that he was a hero. He didn't need 3 years before his death. He died in his 80s, I think. 3 years before he talked about all the pain and so on. The author's point is that why would he make that up? Meineshayden published his memoirs, Diary of a Black Sheep, in 1964, when he was 86 years old. It was, he claimed, based on the 70 volumes of diaries that he kept, starting at the age of 6 in 1884. It is a loosely structured collection of anecdotes, war stories, and accounts of everything from encounters with poachers and insincere women to his meetings with Oscar Wilde and Cecil Rhodes. Among all these, you find a short account leaning heavily on the diaries of his time at the Sussex school, Fonthill. In May 1889, Minos Hagen's parents removed him from Aysgarth, a boarding school in Yorkshire, and sent him to one in southern England for his precarious health. They chose Fonthill, near East Grinstead in Sussex. It was run by two brothers, Walter and Ashton Radcliffe, whose father had started the school. Shortly after the 11-year-old arrived, he complained to his mother that he was frightened of the cruel Walter Radcliffe, who makes me stand in front of him as I go to bed, and had threatened him with a beating. Please don't tell Dan, his older brother, and please may I come home at once. His letter, preserved with his mother's papers, concludes with that sentence. His mother, Georgina Minashagen, was one of a famous set of sisters, the Potters, who made their lives busy with good works and socialist policies. The Fabian Society, probably. She wrote back telling him that masters did not punish little boys without good reason, and whatever punishment would be to my own good. Richard, like so many little boys before and after him, felt desperate. If I could not appeal to my mother with any success, to whom then could I turn? But things soon got 100 times worse. This is what he writes in his diaries. Walter was in the habit of visiting my room after I had retired to bed. Richard himself had been moved from a dormitory to a single room without explanation. I regarded the man with a feeling of loathing and revolt. Bolting my door was no protection, for on the next day the bolt was removed. I did not understand the full import of his behavior for many years. I sought refuge in prayer at the time, but that was of no avail, for I would be jerked to my feet. Soon after, I was bullied in the classroom when Walter would demand an answer to some grammatical conundrum, which he must have known I could not answer. Humiliation, yeah? Stick was sent for, and I was beaten, not once, but several times, with real heart welts. This was a new terror, but it continued throughout the term, beatings taking place 3 or 4 times a week. We will see in the next video and last one about the beatings and what was going on there. At times, I was so bruised and bleeding, I could not play games or sleep at night. I was completely cowed, shamed, terrified, and distraught with fear. At the end of June, Richard appeals again to his mother. This is a little boy, yeah? My darling mother, Walter is a devil and is very cruel and no punctuation, nothing. Walter is a devil and is very cruel, and he beats me many times a week because he says I am obstinate. I am so frightened I cannot answer sometimes, and I think I shall kill him because I hate him so. Do please take me away, because the last time I was beaten, there was lots of blood, and I have never done anything wrong here. It is all because he hates me so. Please come down and talk to Walter. Oh, please, Mommy, do help me. He does not tell her about the visits to his room at night. The other treatment that shamed me into silence, he was to say, just as he doesn't enlarge on that to us 75 years later. Similarly, many people in my correspondence seem to have been able to tell their parents about beatings and bullying, but not the more shameful event of being sexually assaulted. They were quiet about that. The latter might be because of a sense of complicity, all too common, or threats from the abuser. But the fear of not being believed is a powerful deterrent too. Nothing penetrates Mrs. Meinershagen's conviction, nothing, that her son's suffering was for his good. You wonder if it might have made any difference if she had found out about Walter's sexual assaults. Even when Dan, Richard's elder brother, intervenes, on seeing the injuries that the 11-year-old brought home at the summer holidays, she does nothing. Meinershagen's hurt and fury is palpable. His words, if one of my boys, he had a daughter and 2 sons, had returned from school with his back and buttocks black and blue from bruises, and his vest stuck to his back with congealed blood, I should have been furious and distressed. I certainly would never have allowed my boy to return to further sadistic cruelty. I should also have given my boy as much devotion and sympathy as I could, in an effort to heal the injury to his soul and his character. My mother, on seeing my wills, told me I must have behaved very badly. Okay, so Meinershagen resented her all his life. Not for sending him away, but for failing to believe him. You can't help but think, and child psychotherapists know the mechanism, that he was using the beatings as a flag for the thing that he could not talk about, the sexual abuse. But Georgina Meinershagen rejected the cry for help. Richard's reaction was extreme. At that moment, and this is what is going to change his personality, up to now, his little boy, yes, suffering, asking for help, is going to change. He says, this is the way he explains it. At that moment, something broke within me. Even now, I can feel the pain of that moment when something seemed to leave me, something that was good, and something evil entered my soul. Was it God who forsook me and the devil who took his place? I don't know. But whatever left me has never in my life returned. Neither have I been able to cast out the evil which entered into me at that moment. And this is what makes him fascinating, because he goes on to obviously be in the empire with people, other countries, other peoples, and he's going to be extremely cruel with them. Like many other child, the realization of the failure of the adult system of justice results in a dramatic decision, essentially to reject the entire structure of belief. These feelings caused me, at Eton, age 14, to declare, with some high self-regard, that I was not going to be confirmed as a Christian, since some of the Christian adults I had met had been brutes and hypocrites. These acts of rebellion and rejection are pleasurable, and many ex-boarders talk vividly of such feelings. If I can interject here, you see, because he says these acts of, and we are taking him seriously, yes, because he's writing this when he's 83. Yeah, so he says these acts of rebellion and rejection are pleasurable. And I wonder, I have always wondered why, for example, you remember the spies in the 1950s, Kim Philby and all those? Okay. It is said from Cambridge, upper class aristocrats. He was, certainly, I think. And why would they be traitors to the country, and pass information? They were the higher echelons of the civil service and MI6 and everything else, and they were passing information to the Soviet Union. And the explanation is usually that, well, in the 1930s, when there were students, it was fashionable to be a socialist and a communist, and it was. So if you were like today, a middle class or an upper class boy, you had everything. It was fashionable to be a communist and so on. It was an act of rebellion and so on. And that is true. But I always wondered, why did he persist for so long? There was a point after the war, even into the late 50s, when he continued to do so. Now, that was well past, the idealism of, socialism, communism when you're young. He was already an adult. He was already been married, had kids. He was an adult. And he continued. And he was true to the end. And I'm wondering whether this sense of rebellion, because obviously he attended public schools, these kind of schools, whether it was that act of rebellion, of paying back for what he might have suffered too. Rejection of the country that, in his eyes, perhaps had hurt him through the school system. It's a payback thing. I have been wondering about this. I thought of that when he says, these acts of rebellion and rejection are pleasurable. And many ex-boarders talk vividly of such feelings. But to decide you are evil, that is not uncommon either. A man who, this is the author writing, a man who wrote to me about his bad experiences, chiefly unjust beatings at my own school 20 years earlier, says that the anger about them made him demonically focused, aka successful. Demonically successful, attributing a lucrative career to his realization that rules were of no use to him whatsoever. He adds, if the child is broken or weak, he will perish. The psychoanalyst Francis Greer talks of the phenomenon of patients who, as children, decided they were evil to explain why they were sent to board. At that age, it is easier for you to think you are bad than to think that your parents are. These realizations form habits, modes of survival that may shape a life. They did minus Huygens. But the decision to overturn or reject the natural order does not necessarily cure the trauma or soothe the child's hurt. Another result of these traumas for many children, it is told again and again in my correspondence, can be a quite conscious forming of two selves as a device for protection, a notion understood by the psychiatry of personality disorder nowadays. I have several correspondents who have acquired this diagnosis and now use it as part of the narrative of their lives and their ups and downs and ascribe it to others. Similar is the phenomenon psychiatry calls disassociation. Ex-boarders also talk of their inner world becoming detached from the day-to-day world, or going through life as an observer, distant, detached. So it is fascinating to read Richard Huygens writing in his diary long before the era of cognitive behavior therapy on the National Health Service. On the 8th of November in 1889, back at Fonthill at the school and into his abuser's clutches, Walter, he writes, Walter has started again, the beast. And then he says, there are two me's, the outward and visible one, gloomy, argumentative, intolerant, and suspicious. The other me is right inside me, fighting against all these things, longing for a little encouragement and appreciation, hoping that someday and somewhere I shall find love and peace. The formation of two me's allows one persona to do things that the other does not approve of. 4 weeks later, he was contemplating killing Walter. Then he sank into depression. His words, the end of term is near, but I feel I don't care if I go home or not. I feel so unattractive, such a wanderer and outcast, and only half alive. I believe there is good in me somewhere, but it is all trampled down and crushed. Goodness. Minus Hagen remained at Fonthill till his time was up in July 1891. He was intensely unhappy for all of it. But he did learn to fight back against Walter, once hitting him on the head with a stick, and then running away from the school in the hope he would be expelled. He does not muse much on the long-term effects of Fonthill. He reveals that he was sexually prudish and inexperienced for many years without making any connection. But he does say, even now, this is what he writes, even now 3 years before his death in 1967, even now I feel a comparative stranger with many members of my family. The intimacy of childhood can never be perpetuated in manhood unless it has remained unbroken. My false dreams of universal love were dashed to the ground at Fonthill. Hagen went on to Harrow, where he was a little younger than Winston Churchill, a lonely boy with whom he fought. He soon joined the army. Some eminent people were entranced by him. The First World War Prime Minister Lloyd George wrote that Hagen struck him as one of the ablest and most successful brains he had met in the army. He's going to be very successful in the army now. Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, added, that was quite sufficient to make him suspect and to hinder his promotion to the highest ranks of the profession. Others admire him less. Some who were not seduced would perhaps nod at the notion that evil had found a place in Hagen's soul. He and his troops carried out massacres in East Africa, and since his death, Hagen has been accused of at least 2 cold-blooded murders. One of Hagen's detractors was another loner hero of the late empire, T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, yeah? That warrior called the other Hagen savage. In 7 Pillars of Wisdom, Lawrence wrote of Hagen hot immoral hatred of the enemy, in this case of the Ottoman Turks during the Palestine campaign of 1917. And Lawrence writes, Hagen knew no half measures. He was logical, an idealist of the deepest, and so possessed by his convictions that he was willing to harness evil to the chariot of good. He was a strategist, a geographer, and a silent, laughing, masterful man who took as blithe a pleasure in deceiving his enemy or his friend by some unscrupulous jest, as in spattering the brains of a cornered mob of Germans one by one with his African knobkerrie. His instincts were abetted by an immensely powerful body and a savage brain which chose the best way to its purpose, unhampered by doubt or habit. What happened to Richard Hagen? What psychological motor drove this man, so rich in empathy and insight, yet undeniably sociopathic too? He was a collection of paradoxes, moral and amoral, loving and hate-filled, callous and gentle, self-deprecating and self-aggrandizing. He was haunted by the notion of evil and his capacity to do it. That is not uncommon, but what is remarkable is the level of self-awareness. The answer to the Hagen conundrum lies, you have to assume, in the dual self he constructed at the age of 11. It enabled him to be both the sadist and murderer his enemies saw, and the sensitive moral man who appears in the diaries and other accounts. The one certain thing is that at the beginning and end of Hagen's 80-year-long psychodrama, his tribulations and his undeniable achievements stands another two-faced man. Behind all that, Walter, the headmaster of Fonthill School. Okay, a little pause here. I have something else to read. I always forget to check the time. I don't know what time I started, but I have probably been going on for more than an hour. But I want to finish with this because it's chapter 39 of the book, and it's called Boy Love, and it brings it all together. That is why I think I should finish regardless of the time. By the way, you can become a member, join the channel. At the moment, that is for members only. At the moment, all I'm doing is to post 2 lectures a week on Mondays and Wednesdays. A lecture on sociology, beginners really at this stage, sociology and government and politics. But I'm thinking if I could get a few more members, I would love to do this, to read short stories. They have to be short, obviously, short stories from different authors in different languages, translations also, and English ones. And then perhaps share with you what I think the author is teaching us, something like that. So I hope that some of you will join. I also do it, if I tell you the truth, in order to get a little bit of money, a little bit of extra money on the side. But anyway, that's by the by. But let's go back and see if I can finish this as quickly as I can. This is the chapter is Boy Love. There were a variety of seductive justifications for Worsley and others attracted to children. They came in forms both moral and intellectual, excuses polished by generations of emotionally and sexually confused teachers, the pedagogic pederasts, as one of my correspondents puts it. Education at the schools was chiefly in the classics, right up until the end of the 1970s. And so most boys, by the time they were teenagers, learned the stories of love between master and pupil, older warrior and younger. Though there was some talk of their unsuitability, most Victorian publishers of the classical text included tales with a homosexual edge, though they did censor much heterosexual love poetry. Herodotus, Plato, and Xenophon all write of the practice of paiderastia, boy love, Greek word paiderastia, from okay. Most commentators then thought it a significant social phenomenon, at least among the aristocracy of the Greek cities. We're going to see now how this admiration for classical Greek thought and classical Greek society was very appealing to be taught at school. And so an insistence almost of going back to that era and seeing, we would have to get very deep into it, but hence, I'll have to explain this some other time because it's too complicated. I was going to say, hence this new interpretation of Christianity, a Christianity in the Anglican Church that is intellectual, Catholicism being for them a little bit too religious-y, a little bit too, real, the Eucharist, the body and blood, it's a little bit also, to that mind, a little bit too Jewishy. So take that too real reality out and make it an intellectual. Nothing wrong with the doctrine, nothing wrong. Okay, there is this admiration to put perhaps Christianity aside only as a little bit of a cloak, but go back to that Greek era. The most important ancient philosopher, Socrates, it is said, we don't know, but was the lover in some sense of his student and comrade Alcibiades. Socrates' trial for corrupting youth and his subsequent forced suicide by drinking poison is the dramatic climax of the work of Plato, another of Socrates' students. That's one interpretation. It doesn't have to be necessarily homosexual in character. Corrupting the youth could also mean that he was teaching students to ask questions. Instead of giving the answers, Socrates was taught by making them ask the questions. It was a totally different, in other words, not to accept just because it was taught to you from above, from the master. That is another interpretation, but in any case. In Renaissance times, the Italian Neoplatonists held that the act of sodomy was the means by which the teachers of ancient Greece physically transferred virtue or wisdom to their students, a notion the Renaissance men apparently practiced and publicized across Europe. The Victorian teachers, whose job it was to prepare men for service in the course of the empire, could not have ignored these tales. It helped their cause that the Greek stories did not just suggest homosexuality as an educational tool, they also told of the superior fighting abilities of men who were lovers. Greek love remained a common euphemism for sodomy or male homosexuality for most of the 20th century. Ganymede, Aurelius, Patroclus, Jonathan, and Narcissus, the love objects of gods and soldiers in the ancient stories, appear again and again as code for younger lovers in the underground literature of homosexuality. For aesthetes and intellectuals like Oscar Wilde, there was an abiding belief that the love between men was superior to any other, both intellectually and physically. Yes, love between, or the act between a man and a woman, they considered it inferior, more beastly, procreation, all that kind of thing. And they saw this other kind of love as far superior intellectually. Some of them also went to the Bible for this. You can go to the Bible for anything. Quote, I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. Runs a line from King David's lament for his dead friend in the second book of Samuel. Okay, with like anything in the Bible, you have to put it in context, not just what that little thing says, but you have to put it in context. Because if you take the text out of context, you get a pretext. Just saying. But in any case, all right. Some female homosexuals share the notion that love between those of the same gender was superior. Many of the female teachers at the women's boarding schools that were founded towards the end of the 19th century were educated in Latin and Greek like their male counterparts. They would have been aware that there was a grounding for the notion of lesbian love in classical times through the fragments of the poems of Sappho and of Lesbos, though there is no evidence that the same teacher-pupil relationships were part of female aristocratic life in ancient Greece. As I said, in my own particular case, I never, ever saw anything. I swear to you, nothing ever. But in any case, okay. But the vision of an era of tolerance and intellectually sanctioned love between men inspired many homosexual teachers in the 19th and 20th century. They had little knowledge of any other civilization and lauded the classical ones as superior to anything before Queen Victoria's. However mythic, this folk history of pedophilia and its antecedents in a golden age provided an intellectual justification to those who might cast their sexual predation as the celebration of an ancient beneficial teaching practice. You have to find the reason, yeah. The tolerant atmosphere evaporated when the trial of Oscar Wilde and other late Victorian court cases, when those revealed some of the realities of urban gay life. The general public stayed in the dark, but the privileged knew about the revelations in court of boy prostitutes and soiled sheets in seedy hotels. Wilde was given 2 years hard labor. He lost his family and his life and career. His life and career were essentially ended. Nonetheless, the academic interest in classical pederasty continued to grow in essays and books by schoolmasters who were themselves homosexual. John Addington Symonds is the best known of these. He is considered an early hero of homosexual liberation because of a monograph he wrote in 1873 called A Problem in Greek Ethics. Though only 10 copies were published at the time, it became influential. It is the first positive account of classical pederasty. He also restored the male pronouns to Michelangelo's love poetry, outing the artist as homosexual 400 years after his death. As a schoolboy, he played a part in the downfall of the homosexual headmaster of Harrow, Charles Vaughan. These cultured Victorian gentlemen called themselves Uranians before the word homosexual was coined. It refers to the goddess Aphrodite Urania, a female spirit created from the male god Uranus. But the term is best known because of the Uranian poets who produced and published a vast amount of classically flavored sentimental poetry that went as far as it dared in sensual descriptions of young, beautiful men. J.A. Symonds was one of these. Coy and cloying the poetry may be, but it is brave. In The Meeting of David and Jonathan, he wrote that in 1878, Jonathan embraces the young David. Quote, in that kiss, soul into soul was knit and bliss to bliss. hardly shocking now, but it was written less than 20 years after the abolition of the death penalty for buggery. Other Uranian schoolmaster poets are now more comic than tragic. One of the most prolific was John Gambrel, or J.G.F. Nicolson, who taught at a succession of minor public and grammar schools between 1884 and 1925. Each slim volume of poetry and a memoir, Love of a Choir Boy, was dedicated to a boy he had taught. A garland of landslove is a folk name for an aromatic herb. A garland of landslove, written in 1911, was dedicated to Victor Rashforth, who, it should be said, ended his life a finance expert in the Indian civil service, married with children. Generally, the denouement of Nicholson's narratives is piercing disappointment. The love object turns shy of the older man's advances, leaving him to go on down his lonely path, sadder, wiser, and yet more intensely awake to beauty. Rather different was Dr. Edwin Bradford, the most successful poet of boy love. He published moralizing public school tales alongside fruity, muscular verse. That takes the Uranian form from the delicate hinting of Edmund Gosse and Oscar Wilde to something that salutes Kipling and veers into the camp of the carry-on comedies, well known in Great Britain. The poems are earthy, but it is the heartiness that is most shocking now. At last is a chirpy account of a man out on an evening walk after church. His negotiations with a shy little fellow he meets ultimately lead, there isn't really any other interpretation, to satisfactory sex in a woodland grove. Bradford published 10 volumes of this stuff, starting in 1913, with Passing the Love of Women and Other Poems, and ending with Boyhood in 1930. These were well reviewed, without any sideways remarks, in the mainstream press. Bradford continued his day job as a Norfolk market vicar until he died in 1944, aged 84. Among his fans were the poets John Benjamin and W.H. Auden, though the unintentional comedy was surely what they enjoyed. And the author gives here an example of his poetry. And not surprisingly, you can see that it can be rather comic to a poet like W.H. Auden. This one is The Call, very short, The Call. And this is the poem. Eros is up and away, away. Eros is up and away. The son of Urania, born of the sea, the lover of lads and liberty, strong, self-controlled, erect and free, he's marching along today. He's calling aloud to the man, he's calling aloud to the man. Turn away from the wench with her powder and paint, and follow the boy who is fair as a saint. The Uranians were not just poets and writers. One of the most famous was the society painter Henry Scott Tucker, 1858 to 1929. I don't know whether to, I don't know of him. I don't know whether to pronounce his name. Tokeo Tuke is Tuke. He could do for boys' flesh what Renoir could do for women, says one historian, and did it for years on a grand scale, specializing in pink and alabaster youths skinny dipping in shallow water. Tukes now sells for £250,000 or more. Elton John owns 8 of them. Often his models are schoolboys. One Etonian was taken to pose for Tuke by his own housemaster. One of Cuthbert Worsley's colleagues at Wellington in the mid-1930s had a large Tuke in his rooms at the school. A shimmering beauty of an adolescent lying naked in the grass, titled Summer Beauty. The school's headmaster, invited to view it, said merely, "Pretty, very pretty." Worsley slept with the Tuke-owning teacher Roland Staines. He was obviously what we should now call a queen, yet discreet while within school bounds. Worsley is convinced. He writes, Roland was a remarkably good teacher and thoroughly in control of his inclinations. It was his simple rule that while the children were at school, the boys were sacred, and he never deviated from it. But once it was over, once they had left the classroom, it was another matter. Staines had a large mansion near the school where he could indulge his ex-pupils and pursue his affair with Worsley. Since the boys he fancied had to be queer by nature, no harm was done, Worsley happily concludes. It's not an uncommon view. My correspondence from ex-boarders is full of stories of teachers who tested the water with some form of physical pass. Finding the child not compliant, they desisted to try their luck elsewhere. But it was not always the case that an overt rejection was taken as final, or indeed that it had any effect on the predator at all. Worsley left Wellington too, eventually, tormented by his unfulfilled lusts and his failures to resolve his moral qualms one way or the other. The heterosexual colleagues with whom he feuded over the modernizing of the school were increasingly suspicious. They called him the red teacher and were sarcastic about his romantic attachments to the boys. But, as Worsley himself said, they could never quite believe that someone so good at cricket could be so evil in other arenas. He did eventually find his way into the bed of a 13-year-old he was tutoring out of school. But though he tells us the boy was eager, Worsley failed to perform. Some, worse writers and worse men, might have pursued the bachelor schoolmaster's career, pouring their loneliness into bitter-sweet lyrics of unconsummated boy love. But Worsley turns his frustration into action after a few strange months at the newly founded experimental school Gordonston. Now 30, he was at last growing up, he said. He went off to pursue his awakening socialist beliefs and drove an ambulance in the Spanish Civil War. He started to write. His first book, Behind the Battle, in 1939, was about his time in Spain. His next 3 included The End of the Old School Tie, The Barbarians and Philistines, Democracy and the Public Schools, called for the abolition of the schools and of the hypocritical moral codes under which he had fussed, unhappily, for so long. The liberal British elite acknowledged and tolerated the homosexuality of male intellectuals right through to decriminalization in 1967. Havens were found for men who would be at risk in the wider world, not just in the boarding schools, but men-only institutions like the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge, the church, the Anglican Church, and even some regiments of the army, officers only. There is evidence that the female schools may have served a similar purpose. It's pointed out that unmarried mistresses were just as much of a feature of a boarding school as were bachelor masters. At the end of the 19th century, 48 of 50 headmistresses of major girls' schools had not married. In 1975, only 2 of a sample of 19 were married. Many women went into education as teachers and governesses because Victorian Britain offered no other career for them. After the First World War, large numbers of women remained unmarried simply because so many possible partners had been killed. The tolerance of homosexuality within the schools was completely at odds with attitudes in society at large. Homosexual sex was not just a crime for men, not women, savagely policed and punished, but also completely unacceptable in most social milieux. It certainly appears to have been less acceptable than non-violent pedophilia. While it is important not to confuse the two issues, there is an ugly strand that surfaces in the copious underground and pornographic literature of homosexuality in and around the boarding schools, which suggests some men and older boys felt that sex with children was less important, less corrupting than the prescribed sin of homosexuality between adults. That thinking is akin to several other moral justifications. Okay. Falling in love with and having sex with a child is a way to satisfy urges that the emotionally inadequate are unable to satisfy with adults. It is, according to psychologists of sex offenders, the primary motivating force of the most common type of pedophile. It is what Worsley wanted, and he is at his most dubious when justifying it. If only, he muses, in the aftermath of the night of failed sex with the 13-year-old he tutored, if only a trusted and admired man had, with gentleness and love, taught me the uses of my body at the same age, it might have made all the difference. It would have not been an act of seduction, but one of education. As we've seen, men raised in this attitude of tolerance were helped by a philosophy cobbled together by notions of the ancient licensed love between boys and men. When these damaged men left their colleges to enter an unfriendly world where illicit sex, heterosexual or homosexual, was not tolerated, a job in the private schools could provide a lifelong haven. Even at severe and moralistic Wellington in the 1930s, Worsley found 2 fellow masters who would welcome sex with him. He declares, as Evelyn Waugh does, that a majority of the masters were clearly homoerotic to a greater or lesser degree, just as a majority were bachelors. You have to leave the urban pages of Waugh and Worsley and the syrupy ramblings of the Uranian poets to get an idea of what those bachelors were in fact up to when they preyed on the children in their charge. It is a complex story, and it makes for harsh and distressing reading. A survey of the literature, both public and underground, of school-based sexual activity of the late 19th century and most of the 20th century reveals very little in terms of suffering other than the pangs of unfulfilled love. But the unpublished testimony gives a very different picture. Most sexual contact between adult and child was aggressive and frightening to the child, however kind the adult thought that they were being. Moreover, it was and is often accompanied by threats or real violence. Genuine acquiescent encounters, if you believe a child can consent to such a thing, of the type prized by the Worsleys, were not the rule but the exception. Far more common was coercion. Okay, so I leave it here. I thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.